They had something to say about you. For a while, they said it freely, sometimes casually, sometimes confidently, in rooms you were never invited into. Conversations happened across tables you never sat at, among people who spoke about you as if they understood the whole story. And eventually, pieces of those conversations made their way back to you. Not always directly, sometimes through hints, sometimes through second-hand remarks, sometimes through the subtle shift in how someone looked at you after hearing a version of events you had never even been present for. Over time, a narrative formed, not necessarily a malicious one, but a convenient one, a version of you that fit neatly into the expectations of the people telling the story. It was a version that made things simple for them, smaller than what you actually were, less complicated, easier to categorize, easier to explain, and easier to dismiss without any serious reflection. In that version of the story, you had limits that were never actually yours. They imagined a ceiling above you, an invisible boundary that defined how far you could go, how much you could grow, and how capable you truly were. And because that ceiling existed in their minds, they never felt the need to question it. Meanwhile, something entirely different was happening, quietly, slowly, without an audience. And then, eventually, something shifted. Not in a way that announced itself. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment where you stood up and declared that everything they believed about you was wrong. There was no public turning point that forced everyone to reconsider their opinions in a single instant. The shift happened internally. It was a reorientation of how you saw yourself, how you approached your work, and how you used your energy. And by the time anyone outside noticed the difference, the process had already been underway for months, maybe even longer. You had already begun living inside that change long before it became visible. So when people finally looked again, they didn't see the person they thought they understood. They saw someone else entirely. The person they had assigned a ceiling to had quietly removed it. Not through argument, not through permission, but through action, through steady effort, through the quiet discipline of continuing to grow, even while others were still holding on to an outdated picture of who you were. And that is the part most people misunderstand, because from the outside, it can look like a sudden rise, a transformation, a moment where everything changed overnight. But the truth is much quieter than that. This process was never really about triumph or proving anyone wrong. It was about the internal architecture that had been forming beneath the surface all along. It was about the structure you were building within yourself, the habits, the clarity, the resilience, and the intelligence that had been there from the beginning. What surprised them was never something new. It was something you had simply recovered. There is a psychological phenomenon in which a person's performance becomes diminished when they are surrounded by expectations that they are less capable. When an environment repeatedly communicates, through words, tone, or subtle signals, that your intelligence is questionable, limited, or unimportant, something begins to happen beneath the surface of your awareness. A portion of your mental energy becomes occupied, not with solving problems or expressing your full capability, but with managing the perception that has been placed upon you. Instead of focusing purely on the task at hand, part of the mind is constantly monitoring how it is being judged. It wonders whether speaking up will be dismissed. It questions whether an idea will be taken seriously. Over time, this quiet pressure begins to influence how freely your mind operates. Clarity becomes harder to access. Focus becomes fragmented. Thoughts that would normally flow naturally are interrupted by an invisible tension. An awareness that you are being measured against expectations that were never accurate to begin with. The abilities that were always there do not disappear. They simply begin operating under interference, like a signal trying to travel through static. This means the environment where you were being evaluated was never truly neutral. It was an interference pattern, and you were functioning inside it. When someone operates for long enough inside a system that constantly misreads them, the mind begins to adapt to that system's expectations, not out of weakness, but out of the natural human tendency to conserve energy within social environments. But something changes when you eventually step outside that interference. Sometimes that happens through physical distance, sometimes through personal growth, sometimes through a quiet, internal shift in how seriously you take the judgments around you. Whatever the path, once the interference weakens, something remarkable occurs. What was suppressed becomes visible. Clarity returns. Focus sharpens. And the intelligence that once seemed hidden begins to express itself naturally. To those who only saw you inside the interference, this can appear sudden or surprising. They may believe they are witnessing a transformation, a moment where you suddenly become capable, strategic, or insightful. But what they are actually witnessing is something very different. The intelligence that surprised them was never new. What was new was the condition that allowed it to emerge. They did not discover something that suddenly appeared. You recovered something that had always existed beneath the pressure. This distinction matters more than it may seem at first, because the story people often tell is the story of sudden transformation. The idea that adversity somehow created your intelligence, that their dismissal forged the capabilities that now impress them. But that story places the origin of your strength in their doubt, and that is not where it began. Your capacity did not originate from their disbelief. It existed long before it. What adversity actually produced was the moment when that capacity no longer needed to remain hidden. When the interference faded, what had always been there finally had the space to be seen. The system you were navigating was not unique. Many families, workplaces, communities, and social groups unconsciously organize themselves around assigned roles. Certain people are viewed as capable. Certain people are viewed as secondary. Once those roles form, they tend to reinforce themselves. The person labeled capable receives opportunities, attention, and resources that help their capability become more visible. The person assigned a diminished role receives fewer of those conditions, and their performance inside those reduced conditions is then used as confirmation of the original judgment. No one inside the system may consciously intend this, but the pattern persists. Signals accumulate. Who gets listened to? Who gets interrupted? Whose ideas are explored? Whose contributions are acknowledged and then quickly dismissed? These signals eventually form a message. Your intelligence is not what this system organizes around. At some point, you received that message, and for a time, part of you may have accepted it. Not because you lacked awareness, but because sustained social pressure is difficult for any human mind to hold against indefinitely. Eventually, something changed. You found evidence that contradicted the system's narrative, perhaps through a new environment, perhaps through personal growth, perhaps through your own quiet experimentation with what you were capable of. And once that evidence existed, the internal architecture reorganized around it. You began to reinterpret the dismissal. not as proof of your limitation, but as proof of the system's limitation. That cognitive shift required something significant. You reframed the meaning of the evidence. Instead of allowing the external narrative to define you, you began constructing an internal framework grounded in direct experience. You developed resilience. You developed agency. You developed the belief that pathways forward existed even when the environment could not see them. While the system was attempting to stabilize its version of you, something else was happening quietly beneath the surface. You were building psychological capital. Every time you applied your intelligence to a problem, instead of withdrawing from it, you strengthened the pathways that supported that pattern. Every time you chose discernment over compliance, those pathways grew stronger. This work was invisible, but it was real, and over time it accumulated. By the time the change became visible to others, the process had already been running for a long time. Another important shift occurred. At some point, you stopped arguing, not because you lacked evidence, not because you had nothing to say. You stopped arguing because you recognized something fundamental. The system was not going to change through debate. People operating inside fixed assumptions rarely update those assumptions because of argument. Frames change through demonstration. So you redirected your energy. Instead of trying to convince people, you began building the proof. You invested in the work itself, quietly, consistently, without needing the system's permission to proceed. This was not suppression. You did not silence yourself because you were afraid. You made a strategic decision about where your energy would have the greatest impact. You allowed results to speak where arguments never could. That choice required emotional discipline. It required the ability to feel frustration without reacting impulsively. It required holding clarity about yourself without external confirmation. What dismissal ultimately built inside you was something extremely valuable. Not intelligence, but independence from validation. You developed the ability to recognize your own capabilities, even when the surrounding environment presented a different narrative. You learned to trust direct evidence over social perception. This internal stability allowed you to continue building quietly. It allowed you to maintain your direction even when recognition had not yet arrived. When people eventually noticed the shift, what surprised them was not simply your intelligence. It was your groundedness, your composure, the presence of someone who had moved through long periods of being underestimated and emerged with their self-perception intact. That combination is rare. Capability combined with internal authority. And it is rare because the process that produces it is demanding. Most people resolve the tension of dismissal by adjusting their self-perception to match the environment. You resolved it differently. You strengthened your internal structure until the external narrative no longer had the power to overwrite it. What you carry now is not temporary. It is structural. Your clarity, your patience, your ability to build quietly, your ability to maintain direction even without recognition. These are not traits that appeared suddenly. They were forged in the conditions you already survived. The critics were not silenced by your arguments. They were silenced by your accumulation. And the path forward remains the same. Continue building, not for the silence of the critics, but for the full expression of what you already know exists within you. This is the inner calling. I will see you in the next one.